Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 13th, 2017, the event actually took place on June 14th, 2017, during a Republican team practice for the annual Congressional baseball game for charity in Alexandria, Virginia. A man opened fire, and over the course of a 10-minute shootout, he shot U.S. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, Capitol Police Officer Crystal Griner, Congressional aide Zach Barth, lobbyist Matt Micah. I think most of you listening know about this event, remember this event. It is maybe the most recent political event that we've done on this show. But we wanted to discuss it because we talk a lot about political violence on this show. We also talk a lot about how historical moments get skewed or papered over or take on different narratives in different media circles. And this is very interesting on all those fronts and a very recent example of all that, in addition to, I think, just a big traumatic moment in our recent political life. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kellie, I laid out a little bit of who was injured. I think Steve Scalise is probably the most high-profile person who was injured. That Capitol Police Officer, Crystal Griner, really acted heroically as well here and got a lot of press for her actions and received, I believe, a Medal of Honor as well. And I suppose we should mention that the shooter was killed in this incident. What other details of the shooting itself stand out to you, or do you remember?
So the shooting itself is about 10 minutes long, which if you are taking fire, that's an incredibly long time to be shot at. And Scalise is standing at second base, and he's hit in the hip. He shot only once, and as soon as he's shot, he tries to seek cover. He, gets down on the ground and is basically trying to do an army crawl to get to safety. Congressman Jeff Flake is sort of first on the scene for him and does a tourniquet for him, places his hand over the bullet wound to try to stop the bleeding as much as he can. And he's yelling out, are you friendly fire? Because they heard so many guns, being shot. They weren't clear if this was the Capitol Police shooting or if this was the gunman who was shooting at them. So it's a lot of chaos for what seems like a short amount of time, but I can imagine for those who were in it, it was, 10 minutes of terror until the shooter was taken down by Capitol Police.
Yeah, I think chaos is the right word here. I remember when it happened, seeing cell phone footage from apartments that were nearby, and you just hear all of the gunshots ringing out, and it's an interminable amount of time. I mean, as you were saying, 10 minutes is a really long time to be shot at on an open field, right? People were sort of like leaping into the dugout, trying to take shelter there. But if you're like Scalise out at second base, there is nowhere to take cover, which made it an especially terrifying 10 minutes.
Yeah. And, I think that terror and the trauma of that experience for the lawmakers is something that I will confess is part of the motivation for I wanted to do this segment, is just something that I don't think we kind of keep in mind. And I mean, we look at Steve Scalise, we look at Jeff Flake, and the fact that they're walking around having gone through this experience, I think that says something. And, we will get to this, and this comes up when people talk about the insurrection on January 6th, but I also think it's the same sort of thing there. You look at, you're like, we just have to understand the sort of lingering trauma of an incident like that, even for lawmakers who we tend to not think of as real human beings. And in this case, I think you absolutely have to keep that in mind. And it absolutely has affected both the political discourse, but also I think the behavior of individual lawmakers and human beings who had to go through this experience. That's hinting at a bunch of big things that I do want to get to. Staying on some of the specifics of the incident itself, though. The shooter, and I'm glad we're not saying his name. I feel no need to say his name unless either of you feel like it's important to say his name. He died in this. But he was, by all accounts, both mentally distraught, but also left-wing. And so, Niki, I'm curious if you can just describe both what we know about that and also how that started to play out in the coverage of this, the political dimension here.
Right. Well, we know that he was a left-wing activist. As you mentioned, he was somebody who dealt with mental illness. He was also somebody who had a history of violence. Unsurprisingly, in so many of these shooting cases, the men, it's almost always men who carry this out, have this history of domestic violence, and the shooter here had that as well. And he had an agenda. He asked somebody who was near the ball field whether it was Democrats or Republicans practicing. And when he was told it was Republicans, that's when he seemed to make the decision that he was going to attack. And so there was a very clear, I mean, that's as clear of a I am motivated to shoot Republicans story as you are going to get. And a lot was made of this in the press at the time, I think. I mean, it certainly was the case that, at least in conservative media, they pointed out that here was somebody who was often talked about as a Bernie Sanders supporter. Bernie Sanders instantly denounces both this person and the violence and reiterates that he doesn't think that his supporters should use violence in order to achieve their political goals. But that becomes part of the narrative, and in part it comes to mirror or often refers back to the shooting of Gabby Giffords in 2011.
Yeah, just to jump in, that's the Arizona representative who was shot along with, I think, almost 20 other people in 2011. Giffords was a Democrat, but similar situation. The person who carried it out had all sorts of mental issues, but there was this larger political context and motivation as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Remember at that time, there was a lot of finger pointing at people like Sarah Palin, who used violent imagery, like scope shots over the pictures of her political opponents. And there was a big discussion at the time about violent rhetoric and violent acts.
I think all of this is, I believe it's the shooter's brother who also talked about how he had really gone to some dark places, and that, he, as early as March, had moved to Washington, D.C. and was living in his car for at least 3 months until the shooting took place. It's not sure if for how long he was scoping out, this particular baseball field, but it's definitely clear that he had some mental health issues. And then political motivations, I think, bolstered those actions into becoming something very violent.
Yeah. So how do the two of you, I'm just curious, how do the two of you start to pull at those various strands? Because every act of political violence also, I think it's safe to say, has a personal dimension to it, a larger political context. All sorts of different strands come together in these moments. The world is complicated. But I'm curious how you start to pull those strands apart, and then maybe that lets us start to paint a picture of how I don't think the larger conversation around this has been nuanced at all. But I don't know, Niki, where do you start?
Yeah, there are a couple of strands that I pull. One is that this was clearly an act of political violence, and I don't think that we necessarily talked about it as such so much at the time, because there was so much. I mean, it's June 2017. There's so much anxiety in American politics. You have a president who's encouraging political violence. You've gone through the Muslim ban. You've gone through all of these things in a short amount of time. Everything seems so super heated and so fractious that that context has to be understood. I also, because I'm somebody who studies political violence on the right, he doesn't seem to be someone who's connected to a broader network of people planning acts of political violence. And I do think that that's important when you think about the way that terrorism operates, and how those connections and networks make political violence more likely. We don't see a rash of copycats or a rash of attacks against conservative or right-wing politicians in the aftermath of this, and I think that's important. And of course, the last thing I'll throw in is really easy to get guns.
Yeah.
Really easy for people to get guns and to shoot people. And that was part of the conversation as well, because, immediately after there are calls for how do we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And of course, the politics of this are that the very Republicans who were shot were the ones who were saying we cannot restrict guns.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so much about this that's just like duplicitous too. Like when I think about how Gabby Giffords was shot and, the response to that, and I think the response to this just felt a little different to me. I think there was so much, empathy for Gabby Giffords. And maybe that's also because she's a woman, and it's also because of the incidents and how that took place. And maybe that's another episode we can cover. I don't know if we've covered her shooting or not. But, when this took place, I think how quickly it became politicized. All of this, I just feel like, just got so contentious. It was difficult to have a real meaningful conversation about where do we go from here, and what this was a good place to pause. I feel like, especially in the beginning, the first 6 months of Trump's presidency, this would have been a good place to try to pivot, and we didn't get that.
Yeah, and I think that's why, as I hinted at earlier, this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this incident. We just did not have a moment where we stopped and saw this incident for what it was. And I think it was an indicator of what the previous years had been and what the next years would really look like, which is this era of real discord and dissent and tribalism. And when awful incidents happen, we're living in such tribalized context that we can't just have an honest conversation about what is happening and even criticize, quote unquote, our own side. And, I'm not Pollyannish about the power of a president, but I do think that when you have a president like Trump, whose instinct was to play up those divides and force people into their deeply tribalized camps, as opposed to pause and have real conversations, this is what you end up with. That said, Niki, you said something earlier that I'm curious about. You said basically maybe this incident didn't get talked about enough because it didn't tie into a larger pattern and it didn't inspire other acts of violence. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but I do think there is a story of left-wing political violence that gets told on the right that connects and flows from this event to the harassment, or whatever you want to call it, of right-wing figures at their homes or restaurants that Fox News liked to talk a lot about in 2017 and 2018, and then certainly into the Black Lives Matter protests and violence and Antifa and all these things. I mean, whether it's good faith or not, there is a cohesive picture that gets painted in right-wing circles. And this shooting incident is definitely a piece of that puzzle, right?
Yes,
Can I just
absolutely.
say this goes back to John Brown, too? I feel like this goes back to John Brown and Harper's Ferry. But go ahead, Niki.
No, I think that's actually really important, Kellie, because there are armed left-wing groups that identify with John Brown, right? That they use John Brown in their name because they see themselves working in that legacy as well. Yes, if you listen to conservative media today, it is a story that it doesn't start in January of 2017, but it kind of does, where they will talk about the protests that happen on Inauguration Day that were, cars being set on fire in Washington, D.C., and then it goes through to Charlottesville and their arguments that the left was just as violent as the right on that day. I will put down a pen and say that is not the case, but I think that, the way that story is told is that, there's the rise of Antifa and then violence in Portland and anti-Trump activism and the protests over this past summer. Like, it becomes one unbroken line and is used both to excuse right-wing violence, but also to criticize the press for not covering that left-wing violence as the equivalent of what we're seeing on the right.
And certainly, Kellie, as we see more political violence, you see these incidents teased out and politicized in this way. And I think we saw it in around January 6th. A lot of right-wing response to, the calls for we need to talk about the violence on January 6th was, well, we never talked about the violence from Black Lives Matter, but also from this incident. And we saw this incident has come up a lot in recent months.
Yeah, I mean, again, and that's kind of why I'm just saying that this is so duplicitous. Like when we talk about January 6th, I feel like there's a push to sort of dismiss or even like belittle what happened on January 6th. Oh, this isn't an insurrection. Like that's too strong of a word, or trying to find ways to like make January 6th feel more palatable to people who don't want to have to reckon with the violence that moment was. And I also feel like it's the upside. It's like whenever we see it on the left, that has to be harped on, that has to be played up, that has to be emphasized. And so, I mean, this is a common tactic we just see playing on a little bit on both sides, but more on the right. I feel like more on the right. And so I'm not sure necessarily how to address this in a way that feels, I don't know, like a solution. I feel like when we think about how these narratives are told, how these narratives are sold, it's really hard to try to find consensus about not just what happened, but like how we should think about what happened. It's been the hardest thing to try to resolve.
Yeah, with January 6th or with other incidents as well. I mean, I think like part of it is just you have to start with at least on a sense of we have to talk about it, and there's a process, and maybe we don't know what the end of that process will look like, and there's a good chance we will still be in our political camps at the end of it, but can we engage, can we actually engage and look and talk about these things? And instead, I think on both sides, I think you're right that often, given the current state of politics, is often on the right that there's more of this. But there's a sense of anything that is bad behavior on quote unquote my team's side, I'm just going to plug my fingers in my ears and pretend that it didn't happen. Whereas in fact, we need to start just looking at these things for what they are.
I also think that it's a conversation that is hampered by a kind of reflexive all violence is wrong response. And this, I just kind of want to throw it to Kellie because you write about political violence. I don't think that you would get everyone to say that the violence carried out by abolitionists was all wrong. But when we talk about it in a contemporary context, there's not room for nuance about about any of this.
And there's not room for to talk about purpose. I think how violence is used is really important. I also think about the difference between a car being set on fire and a person being killed are two totally different things. Destruction of property is not the same thing as murder. But the way we have these conversations is that if there's a protest and a car is set on fire, that's on the same playing field as, someone being stomped or someone being murdered. And there's no nuance when we have these conversations. There's no gray area or ability to be able to say what is violence and what is self-defense. How do we think about these things?
And it's interesting though. I mean, I'm almost thinking finding the courage and the simplicity to just condemn certain acts of violence like this, like shooting up a congressional baseball practice. Actually frees you up in a way to then have a more nuanced conversation. And some people I think of it as a zero-sum game or something, but we need to see things for what they are, condemn things that we find heinous. That's actually the path towards sort of a deeper understanding and a more nuanced conversation. As we start to wrap up, this has bubbled up and it touches on all these sort of things we're talking about, but there has been a little bit of this, the aftermath of this shooting at the congressional baseball practice. In recent months, there's been some controversy and some conversation about the actual designation of what this event was. Kellie, do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that was been politicized?
So it came out, I shouldn't say it came out, it was leaked that the way the FBI was going to categorize this shooting was that it was a suicide by cop, that you had this, again, lone wolf that was committing this act, but that he was not working with groups or anything like that, and that because of his mental health illness, it compelled him or drew him to do these things. And a lot of lawmakers on the right were upset by that and wanted that verbiage to be changed and wanted the narrative to be, no, this shooter had political motivations and we need to look at this as a domestic terrorist attack and we need to frame it in that way and not depoliticize it. And so that is what's gone on record now is sort of the new story, is that this was an act of, political domestic violence.
Yeah, I think this is such a politically fraught issue. The designation of domestic terrorism has been both an important part of American political life, but also a political football since the 1990s. Right. Discussions after the Oklahoma City bombing on whether or not the U.S. needed more tools to combat domestic terrorism, to name certain groups domestic terrorist groups. And that has really escalated in the past 5 to 10 years, as not only we have this new Homeland Security apparatus that is much more powerful, but the DHS under both Obama and now under Obama and then under Trump have talked about domestic terrorism, in particular white right-wing extremists, as being the most persistent and lethal terror threat to the United States. And so what does it mean when the focus goes from foreign terrorism to domestic terrorism? And what kinds of new powers does the federal government want in order to investigate domestic terrorism? It's such a fraught issue. And there has been a real concerted effort on the right to make sure that left-wing groups are also designated domestic terrorists in order to sort of both sides of the issue, and to take some of the bite out of the, pretty rampant political violence from some parts of the American right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this particular, just in the last couple of months, this particular leak about the designation and then this big pushback about the designation, I think, again, is evidence of how this has been politicized, because I think we haven't actually had the nuanced conversation and ongoing conversation. And so then you get, it's bottled up. No one's talking about it. And then when it gets talked about, it's used in, with an agenda or in an imperfect way. And so, as we wrap up the episode, I guess, if there's any takeaway, it's that we should have complicated and nuanced and imperfect conversations about these very difficult things. And maybe what we just did sort of starts to count. And I'm sure it was complicated and nuanced and imperfect in many ways. But nevertheless, I think this is important to talk about this stuff and remember, the sort of recent history that we're living in, for sure. Now, before we wrap up, this is loosely tied, very serious subject, but it is tied to this history of the Congressional baseball game, and I know we all went down rabbit holes researching that. So do you want to jump in with just a few little lighter tidbits about the history of this game, which, by the way, we should say still took place the next day. They raised millions for charity. There was a huge outpouring, kind of remarkable. But this is a yearly tradition in DC.
Oh, I mean, this congressional baseball game has been going on since 1909, so over 100 years in the making, and it's always, Republicans versus Democrats, and it's a charity, it's a fundraiser. So typically, it'll support things like the Boys and Girls Club or the Nationals Foundation or something like that. But it's meant to just be a show of good sportsmanship, and I've done a lot of research about who's won more games. Apparently, it's tied.
Yeah,
it's tied in wins. 42 wins for the Democrats, 42 wins for the Republicans. There's been a couple ties, I think.
I think last year's got scuttled because of COVID, but the 2021 congressional game is going to be played on Wednesday, September 29th. Maybe we can do a little field trip and go watch it or something. So. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts, and we are, of course, in the middle of our spring fundraiser for Radiotopia. Thank you to everyone who has donated. For those of you waiting to become members, now is the time. Go ahead and become a recurring member and let us know, and we will let you see the big list of ideas that we use to put together this show each and every week. But really, thank you to everyone who has become a member or helped support this show in whatever way you can. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. You can also find a forum at thisdaypod.com where you can find out lots more information about the show. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.